Good morning or good afternoon. I'm Richard Dodds, based in London. I'm State Street's head of Alpha Solutions across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, and executive sponsor of State Street UK Disability Awareness Alliance, the DAA, one of our employee engagement groups. I'm happy to welcome you to the 10th in our series of conversations about justice, equity and inclusion, hosted by the Massachusetts Conference for Women, State Street and the Boston Globe. We had an extraordinary response to this session and are very pleased so many of you are joining us to discuss a complex, common and often overlooked problem in the workplace, ageism. Studies show that over 62% of workers over 50 experience age discrimination. Reverse ageism is also very real, and ageism negatively impacts physical and mental health, workplace culture, and even the bottom line. Today's event is designed to help us change that. You will learn actionable tips for how to recognize and respond to both overt and subtle ageism in the workplace. We will also explore the importance of age diversity and simple ways you can create a culture of inclusion and respect. As the State Street executive sponsor of the UK DAA for the past few years, I can certainly appreciate today's session topic. In my capacity with the DAA, I've had the opportunity to advocate for employees, especially those with disabilities, both physical and neurological, to get the support they need to grow their careers. It is important for companies to recognize the different needs of individuals from all backgrounds and ages to be able to create a safe and healthy environment so that everyone can feel welcome. As such, State Street is one company that is dedicated to ensuring an inclusive workplace for all. In addition to establishing employee networks like the DAA, State Street provides workplace adjustments that can help employees with disabilities, both young and old, to meet their role requirements effectively. Bear in mind that many disabilities occur during the course of one's career, so older workers could, but not always be, impacted more than their younger colleagues. Moreover, at State Street, there are a total of 24 key employee networks where employees can join and utilize as a safe space to connect with colleagues of similar background and interest, and also connect with resources to enhance their work-life experience. State Street's overall offerings also continue to evolve in supporting our employees in all aspects of work, including recruitment, training, learning, and career development, salaries, benefits, and working conditions. One of our offerings, the Be Well program, for instance, is designed to help employees manage physical, emotional, and financial health. Coming back to our subject matter of the hour, ageism, it is a prominent topic currently in the news following the COVID epidemic, where globally, it's evident that many over 50s have left the workforce, and this has led to a shortage of experienced workers. These are potentially very good candidates, and we should embrace the opportunity to fill empty roles with this cohort. Let's dig into this topic further. Without any further delay, here to guide us through this discussion is Peter Capelli, George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the Wharton Business School. Peter was recently named by HR magazine as one of the top 5 most influential management thinkers, and by NPR as one of the 50 influencers in the field of aging, and was elected a Fellow of the National Academy of Human Resources. He is a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal and writes a monthly column for HR Executive magazine. His recent work also appears in the Harvard Business Review. After making opening remarks, Peter will be joined for a conversation moderated by Nicole Smith, Editorial Audience Director for the Harvard Business Review. One final note, today's session is being recorded and a replay link will be emailed to all registrants within the next day or so. Please share the link with others so they can view and benefit from today's learnings as well. Now let's dive in with a warm virtual welcome to Peter and Nicole. Peter, over to you.
Good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you folks and to meet Richard for the first time virtually here. So I have some slides I want to show you. So just in case you're not tired yet of Zoom meetings and things, here's a slide for you guys here. I hope you can see it. Is it popping up for you? If somebody will just give me a yes, that will be make me feel a lot better. We probably all had the experience of talking at length online and then discovering no one is actually there. So if my folks will tell me that they can see the screen, that would be great, and I will plunge ahead.
Yeah, Peter, it's on.
Very good. Thank you, Richard. So let's talk a little bit about the basic issue here, which is quite surprising. So let me show you a couple of things that I show my students. Here's the first one, right? I say, this is you, and that this will happen to you. And for some reason, they're surprised by this. And I think it is important to recognize that if we are lucky, we get to be older individuals and older workers. And this is something that's going to happen to everybody. And the reason that discrimination against older individuals is so bizarre when you think about it is, if you think about other types of discrimination, you might say, you know, if you're white, you're never going to become black and you can persist in discriminating, or if you're a man, you can discriminate against women and you're never going to be, but you're going to become older if you're lucky, right? So we all have a stake in this issue about how we treat older individuals. So we should pay attention to this. You know, why is discrimination against older individuals persist so much then? There's some measures suggest it's the most common and pernicious form of discrimination. Well, one reason, unfortunately, is because a lot of older individuals are responding to the discrimination and playing some of it out themselves. That is, trying to demonstrate that, you know, I'm not one of those old people, sort of thing, you know. So some of it is that, what's going on here. Let's talk about this from a couple of perspectives. And maybe the first one is just in general with demography and what does this mean for the economy? I must say, I'm always puzzled when I hear people, you know, bemoaning the fact that populations are aging. That's a really good thing. You know, I mean, would we be happier if everybody died younger? Is that going to work for anybody? I think the only reason you bemoan this is if you think that people are going to retire at the same age, live much longer, and somehow somebody else has got to pay for that, right? But we'll talk about that issue because the older individuals don't really want that. And we do have to find ways to get them more engaged in working as they get older. And so we're going to talk about that as well and how we can do that. I imagine that's why many people are interested in this topic. I should say, when I first started this, talking about this stuff, I was not an older worker, but now I officially am. So I feel completely competent to talk about this one. Why is this happening? There's a story in the US about it, which is a little different than the story in the rest of the world, but every industrialized country has a population and a workforce that's aging. And that just means getting older on average. And partly it's because in many countries, they're just birth rates are low. It's not really the case in the US. We've got two other reasons. And the first one, which is a really good one, is we're just living longer. For people sort of the baby boom age, we're probably living on average about 7 years longer than our parents, which is remarkable. And here's the most remarkable thing about it. The years of infirmity are actually, in absolute terms, shrinking. So if you're thinking, okay, I'm going to live 7 more years, but those additional years are all going to be incapacitated, that is absolutely not true. The years of incapacitation, or in some ways really struggling with aging issues, are shrinking and declining. And the percentage of people who end up in nursing homes is actually going down. So we're living longer and healthier. What's not to like about that? The other thing, which is a little more US specific, is the huge baby boom is moving into the older category now. So it's not just that we're living longer, although that's going to persist and probably even grow. It is, we have now this big cohort in the older category, and that's what's causing us to pay attention to this. Here's the important thing, and I think this is lost. I think we think that lots of older people, or most of them, just want to retire. Turns out not true. And some of it is because we need the money, and okay, that's fine too. But a lot of it is simply because people want to work longer. And in our society, maybe uniquely, working is associated with your connection with other people. And so that is why even people who are retired, who say they don't need the money, want to keep working, because This is a way of staying engaged, right? Now, the story, at least in the US, about older people not staying in the workforce is not true, actually. The decline that we saw after the pandemic in a particular age cohort, labor force participation, is simply extending a trend that was going on before the pandemic. We just didn't notice it because we were in the middle of the pandemic. But look here, this is hot off the press. I just did this today from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this is the labor force participation rate and the percent change. And you can see in red, it's for the older categories, and you can see it grew by a lot. And it will continue, projections are, to grow by a lot going forward. So the important part of this story is it's not the case that older workers are staying out of the workforce. In fact, increasingly, they are in the workforce. Now, some of this is simply because there's just a lot more of us, right? But nevertheless, it means a lot of older individuals who are of the ability to keep working and want to keep working. So the problem, just to get ahead of us here, is going to be, why can't they? So let's talk about that. Survey a little while ago anyway found that when they surveyed people approaching retirement age of 65, which used to be the norm, it's not really anymore now. It's a little younger and a little older are the mode. But retirement doesn't mean permanent either, right? As a lot of our recent quarterbacks, for example, in Boston, former quarterbacks, are persuading us. 75% of those people said they wanted to keep on working. Now, here's the killer, though. Of those, at least as of a few years ago, only about half of them actually do. And if they have to find a new job, that is not simply stay longer with their current employer, only a quarter of those folks get new jobs, even though they want to, right? So what is happening there? And that has to do with the myths about discrimination. Let me just see if I could get you to remember this example. And the example is, suppose you're going to a doctor, into a hospital, and you say, give me the oldest doctor, and people would laugh at you. But if you said, give me the most experienced doctor, they would say, of course. Well, age and experience are incredibly correlated, right? So if you substitute the word experience for age, people would think discrimination is just crazy. Everybody, I think, would. But if you use the word age, then it seems like it's to some extent almost sensible, right? So bear that example in mind. What we know about older workers compared to younger workers, here's the good news, older folks, we're better at everything. The only thing we're not better at is solving novel problems under time pressure without the ability to use a calculator or paper and pencil. So if you got to take SAT tests, you really want a younger person. Other than that, the job performance on every dimension of older people is better. Now, you might think, for example, it is surprising that they quit less because you think they're going to retire, but the average tenure in the US is only 4 years of workers. People who are younger job hop much faster and much more frequently than people who are older. And here's a happy note. As you get older, on average, happipiness increases, as does contentment. And I'm sorry for those folks who are in their late 20s, you've hit bottom. Or if you're younger than that, you're probably going to hit bottom. But the good news is after that, everything picks up. Do older workers cost more? No, there's no premium for age in any of the wage equations that you can examine. There's a premium for experience. We just think it's age related because remember, those are completely correlated. And there was a study done for AARP a few years ago that found that healthcare use is not more expensive for older individuals, if you have insurance as an employer for your employees. And the reason is because it's more expensive for young people than you would have thought because they've got kids, right? And they're covered. So it is true that older people themselves use more medical care, but they don't cost more because the family coverage, which they're part of, does not, those folks use a lot more medical care, right? So actually doubling their study found that if you double the percentage of people over age 55 in a typical employer, it raised the total compensation cost by almost nothing, right? What do employers say they want all the time? Just look at this list and see if it sounds like what you hear. People are ready to go, don't need training, good interpersonal skills, all that kind of stuff. And the evidence we've got on workers and their age and their other attributes says that older people are better on all these things, right? And you say, what do older workers want? Well, it's nothing quirky, right? Is anything here, if you're younger, say, no, I don't want any of these things, right? They want pretty much the same thing that everybody else wants, right? And some of these things are free if you're an employer. Like, give me a chance to use my skills. Why not, right? So we talked a little bit at the beginning here about why more older workers aren't being hired. And the reason, of course, is age discrimination. And it's quite pervasive. A few years ago, I saw this survey from IT employers, and a majority of them said that they wouldn't hire anybody over age 40. They didn't even seem to know that it's illegal to say that. At least they, I suppose, were honest and revealing about it. And as Richard was saying before, this is pretty common stuff. A lot of people report their experience with this. Here's what's a little different about older workers now, and that is that it is more common now to have younger supervisors. That is, supervisors who are supervising people who are older. I think that's kind of the new thing. And I should say, when I talk to Nicole about this, I will remind her and us that they were my publisher for a book we wrote a while ago on this topic. And the problem comes, I think, that's new, is when you have younger subordinates thinking about whether I should hire somebody who is older than I am, remembering you're also probably talking about somebody who has more experience than I have, right? Can younger supervisors get their hands around that? That seems to be the issues. And what we see, you look at some of the evidence here, it probably is true that older subordinates often resent younger supervisors. That's probably true, but that is something, remember who's supposed to be in charge here, it's a supervisor. It is something that they can do something to fix. And we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. This goes back to Richard's point here about where people first started to see age discrimination. And, it's not necessarily when they are particularly old, right? This is when they experience it themselves, I should say, right? So how do we fix this? Well, I guess the first thing to notice is that older individuals who are probably getting close to the end of their full-time work life anyway, there are some things that are different about them. You're not going to motivate them by threatening to fire them. It's much less of a concern if you're near retirement than if you're in middle age and you got 2 kids in school, right? So, trying to use the stick and the carrot of saying, if you just hang in here, you'll get the big bonus, not so motivating as it is if you're younger. And if you don't behave, we're going to fire you, not so motivating either. And neither is because I said so, right? It probably didn't work with your kids very well. It certainly didn't work with mine, but as you get older, it works even less well, right? So this is just a little reminder if you're a supervisor about what is not going to work. You probably shouldn't be doing these anyway, but for older subordinates, they work even worse. So what are the solutions here? The US military, and I imagine militaries around the world, have thought about this a lot, because they've got second lieutenants who are typically 22 coming out of service academies or college, supervising sergeants who are often in their 30s or 40s, right? And how do you do that? They had a lot of bad experiences with this, certainly in Vietnam. And the model, US Marine Corps has got a nice model. And basically it says, treat that older subordinate as a partner in this, right? And interestingly, we find that job performance in teams is actually best when you have older people and younger people working together as peers. And you might say, why is that? Because they don't feel like they're competing with each other. They feel like they've got sort of separate life roles and they're not all competing for the same stuff. But the general idea here is engage the older person, particularly with things that they know, that they are quite likely to know more about what they're doing than you are, but you shouldn't be managing that way anyway, based on I know more than you do, right? Because you never or shouldn't know more about what all your subordinates do than what they're doing, right? So what kinds of things should you be doing? Well, you could look at this list. This works for everybody. If you look at these stories about younger people and generational differences, which frankly don't seem to be true, the generational differences story, but older workers look a whole lot more like younger workers than they do like middle-aged people. And the reason is, frankly, middle-aged people have a lot more responsibilities. And you can manage them, I guess, with carrots and sticks more easily, right? It is still the case if you're a supervisor that you're accountable for performance. And sometimes that is a problem, right? In that older subordinates don't get a lot of feedback on their performance from younger supervisors, okay? So what works particularly well? I mean, these are some companies that had interesting practices. Edward Jones brought back the retirees to do the onboarding for new hires and tell the stories about the companies. Deloitte, at least for a while, was letting their partners, when they hit a certain age, say, if you want to hang around for the next year or so, perfectly fine. You tell us what you'd like to do because you've been here long enough and committed enough that you probably have some pretty good idea of what to do. And the CVS story, which is an interesting one for jobs which are not executives, and that is they understood on the East Coast, a lot of people go to Florida in the winter. So they basically offered their retirees in the Northeast jobs in Florida in the winter if they were going there anyway. I mean, a pretty simple, pretty obvious thing to do, right? So let me pause there. I mean, this is our book that the Harvard folks published a while ago, and ask Nicole to come in and we'll talk to her and you folks about kind of questions and things you are seeing. Nicole, my publisher, nice to see you.
Hey, Peter, I have to tell you, where were you on my first management job when I had people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I was in my 30s at the time? I have been very, very happy to have had you, but we all have you now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I actually have quite a few questions from our audience that came in pre this event. So I want to really lead the conversation with that, and let's get started. First with Janet, she said, how can we frame age as an advantage and not as an obstacle? Do you think it's viewed as an obstacle, first of all?
Well, I think these prejudices about older workers are the problem, right? And everybody knows somebody who at work who was old and seemed to be burned out. I would say in almost all those cases, the problem is that they, and unless they're sick, which does happen, of course, right? It happens to everybody, and maybe for older individuals more likely. But what really happens is they're stuck in the same job for a long time. And that happens with young people too. I mean, somebody who's in their 30s who's doing the same thing for 10 years is likely to be burned out as well. But I think I would remember that story about the difference between age and experience, right, which are highly correlated. And I think, you know, there's just tons of evidence on everything. If you just ask them, what do you want? Social skills to be important now? Yeah, well, you know, older people are better at that. And getting along with other people, yeah, we're better at that. And, you know, knowing how to just get stuff done, we're better at that because we've done it before. So what do you want, right? I mean, what are you worried about, I guess, is what I would ask them. And I think it's important to start calling people out on this too, right?
Yeah, it is. It's funny that you say that when you were talking about we're better at this, we're better at that, referring to an older generation. I actually found that on my own team, where if I wanted something done and it was thorough and a nice attitude, I'll be very frank, it was the baby boomers that I just knew I could count on. It took a lot more coaching from some of the other generations, particularly the younger cohort. And I was
because we're experienced, right?
Yes. Well, you know, yes, you've learned, you've gone through, you know, the rights and what can happen if you don't get it wrong. And that is a very true statement. So I can attest to that. Jennifer wanted to know, how can I combat ageism as a hiring manager? Or can you?
You certainly can. I mean, I think one of the general problems with discrimination in hiring of all kinds is, what does your recruiting materials, what do they look like?
What do you mean?
Well, if I go to your website, for example, I'm interested in your company and maybe working there, and no one looks like me, then, you know, I sort of get the signal a little bit, as compared to if I look and I see people who look like me in the materials, right? What kind of language are we using in our materials? Are we talking about language that sounds stereotypically young? You know, are we talking about, you know, energy, enthusiasm, that stuff? We talk about experience, you know, what is it that you really want? Make sure that your language corresponds with what's the things you really want in the workplace. I think the problem comes on the recruiting side first, you know, so having the right kind of people apply and making sure that you are getting older workers. You know, there are ways you could target those folks if you want, and any recruiter will tell you how to do that. But making sure when you're doing the next cut, and the next cut is getting to the short list, that if you see people who are older being tossed out, just ask why. So we would like people to sort of confront what their expectations are about older people. Why this guy who's 60, what's the problem with her, and just make them articulate it. And then, if you articulate it, then it starts to sound ridiculous, but unless you have to surface it, it persists, right?
Right. Well, one of the things that you were talking about caught my ear when you were talking about resentment, right? And so I was one of those young managers who was, like I said, in my 30s, and I managed people who were in their 50s and 60s with grandchildren. To be fair, not everyone in that age group. Some were very welcoming, and I want to learn from you. I can teach you, you can teach me, and we got along right off the bat. But others did feel a sense of why you. If you have a younger manager in that position, I can even, at least from my point of view, I could understand that if someone put their entire career, perhaps even in the same company, and then you come in, you could at least try to understand how they feel. If I'm a younger manager managing older and more experienced generation, how would you approach that resentment or that feeling?
Yeah, so I think there's two contexts that the experience might be quite different. One is that you got a job that the older subordinates thought they should get, right? And that is tricky, but it's no trickier than if you were the same age and you got a job that they think they should have gotten, right? It's not just
so true.
not just because you're older, right? So I think the more unique thing is if you come in as a superior to manage people who've been doing their jobs for a while, right? And back to the models from the US military, I think what a good younger supervisor will do is be upfront about this and say, look, I know you know more about this than I do.
Yes.
Because that should be true for all your subordinates. So start with that. And, you don't probably have to coach them, which for you is a time saver. And so when you have a problem or project that needs done, rather than scope it out and dump it on them, say, let's scope this out. Help me scope this out, right? So engage them in this rather than top down. So the big problem, which is it's bad for everybody, but it's worse for younger subordinates and older supervisors, is if you don't engage them and recognize their experience. Nobody likes that. I mean, if somebody's 22, you probably do have to scope these things out for them. But if they're 50 or 60, you should at very least do it with them. Now, you do have to, you're not, that doesn't mean they're your peer. You're still responsible for performance and you still have to hold people accountable. And one of the things that we sometimes worry about is younger subordinates find that difficult to do. They say, God, this guy's as old as my father. I can't talk to him. Well, of course you can talk to him like that. You just have to say, here's what needs to be done. I'm the intermediary here. The bosses are telling us we have to get this project done by this time. How are we doing on this?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you're rapping their knuckles, but you're reminding them, here's what we got to do. What kind of progress are we doing on this? It's basically good management for any age group, right?
I love that inclusivity aspect and the collaboration aspect that you add to that. Sarah has a question for you. She asks, can you talk about gendered ageism and how women and men are perceived differently as they age? That sounds like a hot topic.
Yeah, well, I'll ask you what you think about this, not on the age side, but on the gender side. You have experience that I really don't have that experience as to how it would be different. But I think we are used to having older men in the workforce and lots of them. And we're not so used to having older women in the workforce. At least for previous generations, lots of women left the workforce at childbearing age and didn't come back, right? And more recent generations, they are coming back, right? So it's a relatively new phenomenon. So some of it is just that, I think. But let me think for a second here. I got anything clever to say on this, and I'll ask you what you think.
Well, I can only speak from my experience. I will say that
experience. So Garrett, there you go.
I will say that I feel like the older cohort of women are concerned about this. I do think that it's probably more connected to child rearing and childbearing. And those are the women that often have to face the decision of to stay or to take more demanding leadership roles or things like that than it is the woman getting older. It's only 24% of women in senior leadership positions globally. So there's that they're just not, as you said, we don't see them as much. But it's been said and discussed that it's women who childbear and who have children who might have trouble rising up the ranks than necessarily a woman who's just getting older, as we all do. So that might be a little controversial for the people.
I think that sounds right. I think the other thing is there's probably still expectations that women will be more likely to be caregivers even when they're older than men. And I think for the employers, it is perfectly reasonable to ask people, you know, are there things do you have situations which are going to make it difficult for you to do your work? But there's nothing about caregiving that's any different than any other kind of obligations with respect to that, you know.
I will say that, you know, if you pulled in sexism is another ism into this, I don't know that any woman doesn't experience that, whether it's young, middle, or end. If you have a person who has a filter or bias that way, I don't see them holding back for younger women, but they do older women. So I think I would think about the correlation there if there's actually a true one. So I have another question for you. This is from Kate. So obviously she's a younger professional. She said, I'm at the beginning of my career, a newer professional. How do I navigate the mentality that I should, quote, just wait my turn and put in my time because everyone had to do it and pay their dues? I actually hear this a lot from young people.
Do you really? Well, you know, the surprising thing on that is we used to hear that 30, 40 years ago. And the reality, of course, is that that was really not true and hasn't been true for a while. So I think, you know, I hate to say you're just in the wrong place, but maybe you are. If you're in an organization where they're saying, you know, it's time and grade that really matter. There are very few places that are really like that anymore, where it's literally true. I imagine it's the kind of thing that you're hearing from your immediate superiors just above you. And, you know, this is career advice, got nothing to do with aging. But if you are in a job where you want to do more and they won't let you do it, you need to move.
Yes.
Really, right? Because that is how you get ahead. And you'll be really frustrated if there are things you want to do. You should get to an employer who will embrace that. I mean, any good employer loves that. If somebody comes to them and says, for example, you know, here's a project I'd like to be part of. I would like to do this as well. And if you've got bosses who say, no, wait your time, you should go elsewhere.
I agree 100%. So there's a question that just came in. And I don't have the name of this person, but they said there are some seasoned workers, I suppose where they work, who verbally share that they aren't interested in learning new software and systems. How do I navigate that if they have no interest to learn a new system? I will say, Peter, right off the top, before you answer that question, studies show that there is 100% the ability for an older worker to learn tech just as younger people. So there's not that. But what do you say to the person who's struggling to get an older cohort to learn new systems or tech?
Yeah, and I think just one more thought on that. There are, I mean, our brain does change a little bit, and the sort of fluid intelligence, you know, novel problem sort of thing does decline a bit, but what we call the crystallized knowledge, and this is your experience, compensates for that typically, right? So you're right. Now, it could very well be you run into those people. I don't know that it's completely correlated or even highly correlated with age. There are people who just, you know, don't want to do anything new, don't want to learn. That happens. I think that you have to be clear with them if you're the supervisor that, you know, your career is kind of over if that's your situation. I mean, we're not going to make you learn anything new, but you're not going to progress. Okay, for that, that's fine. But also, it's often likely to be the case that you may not stick around because your current job changes, right, in terms of what we require people to do. And if you can't update your skills on that, that is how contemporary organizations work. I may not like it, but it is the truth. So I think the navigating that one is just pointing out to them, you know, just long term, this is probably what's going to happen. It's not that I'm threatening you, but this is what typically happens to people who can't change or won't change.
So this is something you talked about a little bit in your presentation there. So this question says, I see companies prioritizing recruitment for younger workers, yet many younger workers seem to job hop more often than even after a lot of development and training investment from the employers. Are there stats that show older workers are more loyal or tend to have a higher ROI?
For sure, turnover rates are low, and you could go follow your tax dollars to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and you can just look at tenure by age. And tenure is way lower when you're younger. People do job hop more. It's kind of sensible. You're just figuring out what you're good at and what you want to do. A lot of the jobs that younger people have are not jobs that give career ladders where they could advance from within anyway. So that absolutely is true. And are older workers less likely to quit? Well, again, you can just look at that data and see. I think there's just a myth that they won't stay long because, they're going to retire. And then people forget that your current workers turn over all the time as well. Right? Right. So it's what are you comparing to, I think, is what you should remind them of.
So Amy brings up a hot topic for the past few years, DEI. She says, how do we get companies to add an anti-ageism policy as part of our DEI efforts?
Yeah, well, I spent some time a few years ago working with around the topic of discrimination against people with disabilities. And they were, as I think older people are, kind of envious of what other groups have been able to achieve. LGBTQ in particular, right, which in a pretty short period of time got a lot of recognition and a lot of change. And so the question is, why does that not happen for older workers? And, the reason is they're not kicking up a fuss. And some of that is because I think they believe that they don't have to, because I can hide, I will act young. One of the ways I act young is I go along with discrimination of older people, make fun of the people who are just a little older than I am. I mean, it's kind of pernicious because you will be there yourself. But I think that's part of the problem. But the short answer is they're not kicking up enough of a fuss about it. And until they do, and that probably means, unfortunately, more lawsuits, right? Age discrimination lawsuits and things, we probably won't see companies responding to it.
Yeah. A couple people asked about reverse ageism. Is there such a thing?
Tell me what that means. Discrimination against younger people?
I would assume so.
Well, I'm sure there are contexts where it is true, where, as you were saying earlier, Nicole, where there are older people who are irritated about the younger people coming along. But, in our society, we still kind of venerate youth, right? So it's not like it's a protected group or needs protection as a group in society. So I don't think we see a lot of that. I think the reverse is way more common, particularly with young people out of college, this belief that it is really important for employers to get those people. There's some contexts where it's probably true. In the world of IT, for example, pretty well known that IT companies really don't develop their talent, that particularly for hot topic skills, they just go to colleges and hire the kids who are graduating with those skills. They don't keep them, but they would kind of rely on a fresh class every year to supply their needs for changing talent. But aside from that group, there really is not any particular argument for needing young people per se.
I will say, as a person who spent most of my career young so far, I feel like there's more opportunity to overcome it, even if you have those comments, that attitude to be hired away or somewhere else. So I think that even if you're receiving it, your opportunities can often look different because of how ageism plays out.
Yeah.
So it's funny because a couple of people talked about gray hair in the workplace. One person said, once I stopped dyeing my hair, opportunities for promotion started to slow down. My mentor suggested that I start dyeing my hair again so I don't look older than I am. Peter, do you have any ideas of how to overcome this obstacle? And there were a couple of people who talked about gray hair and dyeing and the appearance of looking older.
Well, right. I mean, this is the issue. Do you kind of yield to the discrimination? And I don't want to make it sound like we should all be martyrs, right? Because in every workplace, the employers have the power, and you can't be fighting all the time, the good fight on everything, right? Don't work for an employer who discriminates on this dimension. Don't work for an employer who has these attitudes, et cetera, right? So, I don't know what the sort of moral thing to do, what the right thing to do is in that context, you know. I think for sure the wrong thing to do is to play along with discrimination. But, you know, in terms of the subtle aspects of acceptability in a workplace, do you have to fight it all the time? You know, I wouldn't feel like you're a coward if you did things in order to fit in, and particularly knowing that in your organization, you're going to be kind of punished if you don't, you know?
Well, speaking of that, someone asked about advocacy. They asked, what are best practices for self-advocacy, right? And holding others accountable. How do I go about telling someone that point of view or frame of mind isn't helpful or right? And how do I advocate for myself?
Yeah. You know, I should confess in this context, my own experience, and that is, you know, if you're a tenured professor, you're pretty invincible, right? I mean, you know, you can't fire us, you know, so you can confront people on these things and you don't have to worry about stuff. I think you could and probably should press them for explanations as to why they are not promoting you or why you think they see you in the way they do. You know, one of the things that I heard this story a while ago at a company, that they weren't hiring older people because they didn't think they would be there long enough to be promoted up the ranks to the very top kind of thing, you know. And I think the appropriate response is, well, just how many of those people actually make it to the top anyway, right? I mean, the odds are like maybe 1 in 100 that you're actually going to advance from a first level supervisor up near the executive suite anyway.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, really, is that, I mean, how many people stay?
Right.
You know, if your average turnover is 4 or 5 years and you're not going to hire me because you think the probability of me staying for 15 years is a little lower. I mean, is that really? I mean, I think, but this is just me, you know, the tenured professor. I'm inclined to kind of confront them with is this really what you're saying? You know,
Well, see, you can use your privilege at that point. And, you know, we all have privilege in some way. So you can use your superpower.
Yeah, I just recognize that, you know, I can't be fired for having a smart mouth and lots of other people can.
That makes one of us.
Yeah.
So Natasha has a question. She says, how does a young worker set realistic expectations for career growth? It's often hard to look at older workers who are flourishing and compare your career to someone who is experienced. It can feel that as a young person, you should be moving ahead faster. So there's the comparison a little bit.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is not direct answer to your question, but it is, I think, extremely useful thing to do. Go talk to them. You'll be astonished at how open older people are to help you as a younger person. They don't feel threatened by you, and you're not threatened by them. And they're typically just delighted. It'll really surprise you. And ask them these questions. And what I think you'll find is, well, one thing just to bear in mind is that people who are at the very top are not typical, right? Mm-hmm. So their experience is not necessarily what you will experience yourself. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't aspire to it, but you should recognize that it took an awful lot of luck, frankly, for people to get to those positions. And some of the luck is simply things like health. You know, I mean, you don't get to these very top positions if you have chronic illnesses or you have life events which really disrupt you. So a lot of it is kind of luck. So I would ask them that. And I would, when you talk to a few people about that, I think you start to recalibrate what's possible. But I wouldn't just talk to the superstars. You know, right. I would talk to the older people in regular jobs and see what the difference is and try to get a sense, for example, too, of how much the superstars maybe had to give up, you know, in order to get to that position, just so you understand in terms of your own expectations, is this something that I want to do, right? And go in with your eyes open, right?
Yeah, you know, that's a great point. We often look at the outcomes people have, but we don't really focus on the journey to get there.
And we don't look at the people who stumbled along the way, right? I remember like during the .com period, everybody I talked to had made millions of dollars betting on these startup companies. But you never heard from the people who got wiped out. And at the end, you know, at the end of the .com boom, you know, people were sort of back to where they were before. So a lot of people got wiped out. You only hear about the success stories, and those are the ones you see, but it's not average, right?
Right. That's a great point. So social media is a huge part of our world now. And someone asked advice about this. So they said, what is your advice, Peter, on avoiding ageism when it comes to choosing professional photos like a LinkedIn profile photo? It doesn't seem like a good choice to present yourself younger than you are, yet we all tend to choose photos from our younger years.
Yeah, right. Well, I think because the norm is that you should literally put your best face forward, you probably should do that too, right? Because that is the cultural norm in these contexts. I mean, you can't sort of fight fight biases and fight perceptions on every aspect of your life. Interesting, I was just involved in some hiring decisions outside the US, and it's very common to have your photos still on your resume.
Oh, really?
Which is, bizarre if you're thinking about trying to be fair, right? Because we know we are highly influenced by attractive people, right? Juries don't convict people who are good looking, all that sort of stuff, right? So it is a type of unfairness, you might say, that is pervasive, really hard to change, I suppose. And, what do you do about it? Well, you probably can't fight it the whole time. Like I'm going to pick my ugliest photo just to show them, well, it's, not going to work.
Yeah. So when it comes to interviewing, someone said, how do I handle when an interviewer says that you're overqualified for a position, too much experience, too old? Also, should I be cutting down my resume and CV, make it shorter to get rid of that valuable experience, even though it's relevant?
Yeah, isn't that like the stupidest thing ever? Somebody saying that, look, you're too good for this job, right? What they're actually saying, if they're thoughtful and would say it better, is that I think you're going to get bored in this job and leave because of that. I mean, that's not a crazy thing to say if you think that's what's going on. I think the response to that should be that, look, if I get there, there are always additional things that somebody can do and take on, and that's been my experience in the past. Jobs are pretty fluid. The job says you do this, but there are all kinds of extra things to be done. And there's all kinds of work that could be delegated from my supervisor to me if I prove that I'm competent to do that. So, you're not putting a little screw into a little hole here. You're hiring a human being for a job which is not neatly defined. I mean, you're not on the assembly line for these jobs, right? There's a lot of stuff that's flexible.
Someone asked, I've always thought older workers typically have fewer distractions. So think they're able to work more hours, they're more flexible because they don't have childcare responsibilities and are able to travel more for work. I'm curious if you see this as a trend in your research.
That's a good question. I think, one of the things about older individuals, frankly, is true, which I'm noticing myself, is that a lot of these things which sound fun when you're young are not so cool when you've done them 100 times, So like the opportunity to get on a plane and fly to Europe. Okay, that sounds like fun when you're 22. Once you've done it a few times and you realize you're losing a night's sleep, to do that, it doesn't sound like quite so much fun. So it is true that they do have more flexibility than when they had children. They might not necessarily want to give that flexibility to their employer. But again, why not ask them? I think one of the worst attributes of employers is when they say they wouldn't want to do this job because it doesn't pay what their old one did, for example. Well, ask them.
Yes.
They know what the job says. They've seen the pay. Ask them. They're adults at this point. And, you might want to find out why they want to do this job that is less title than what they did before or less responsibility than what they did before, and see if they've got a good answer. And I bet they do, right? So, I don't think we should try to make too many assumptions about what people are interested in and what they want to do. Just ask them. It's not hard.
I love that. Start with the question instead of the assumption. So someone asked about salary transparency in this trend, and they say that it's connected to a salary. This is a salary for a role to reduce gender wage gaps affecting wage differences between older workers and younger workers, where work experience may no longer be considered in the base salary or increase as older workers may have reached the max of their position simply for longevity loyalty. So do you think salary transparency essentially will affect older workers or younger workers? Do you think it'll have any impact?
Well, I think, as I said before, there's not a lot of evidence that people are paid more because they're older. And increasingly, there is not that much evidence of pay based really on tenure, right? That's, you get an increase simply because you've been here longer. And in fact, the evidence is pretty clear that people do better when they leave and go someplace else than when they hang around, So I don't know how big a problem that is. I don't know that transparency will change it very much. I think transparency is going to be a headache for employers, to be honest. And the simple reason is because we don't have particularly good justifications for why people are paid what they're paid right now. And we've got all kinds of special deals that were done in order to retain this person or that person, and they're hard to explain to other people. So I think if you're an employer and you're asking yourself, how big a problem will this be? The way to answer it is, could you explain to your employees now why the people in their group have the pay that they've got? And if you can't explain that in a way that's going to be palatable, you're probably going to have a big problem.
Yeah, you've said this is probably the second time you kind of said that, where can you explain it? And when you say it out loud, how does it actually sound?
Yeah, I think that on that, it's a good point, Nicole, that, there's a lot of practices which are common and are just lousy practices. And some of the things we're talking about just get revealed in this context,
Someone said, do you think is reverse mentoring the answer to encouraging generational problem solving?
Well, first, can I rant for just a minute here about generational things? So
Yeah.
The National Academy of Sciences, I'm like their PR manager. They issued a report on generational differences a year or so ago. These are demographers, people who study this stuff. And they concluded there's no evidence for any of this.
Okay.
There's no evidence for millennials or Gen X or Gen Q or whatever, that there are age differences. So as you get older, predictable things happen to you, right? And the reason we have these crazy notions of generations is older people look at younger people and forget that that's what they were like when they were younger, right? That's basically the story, what all this is going about. But back to the question of reverse mentoring, right? Which I think is a really smart thing, as we said before, because they can teach each other things. I think we are overdoing the idea that young people have a lot to teach older people, frankly. It is particularly about the workplace. I mean, younger people know a lot more about what's going on in their lives and contemporary culture, that kind of stuff. It isn't necessarily true that all young people are more tech savvy. The fact that I spend more time on my phone does not mean I'm tech savvy, or I play a lot of computer games. It doesn't mean I can write computer games, right? It just means I play on them. So I think we're kind of overplaying that. And I think as an employer, I wouldn't set it up with the expectation that older folks, you need to learn from these younger folks here. I think that's kind of a myth that, technology is a young person's thing and that somehow you're just different if you grew up with a computer than if you grew up and didn't see a computer till you were 20. I just don't think there's evidence for that or enough evidence that it really matters.
Yeah, I think actually I agree with that. I think that's a very powerful argument. I think this is a good question because a lot of us might find ourselves in this situation. One person asked, how can you politely identify and correct a comment as inappropriate? So how do I go about these one-on-one engagements?
Yeah, this I think is really a question about interpersonal skills, which I can't say I'm an expert on, but you can get away with an enormous amount if you smile when you say it. That's my advice to children on this, if you're calling people out, especially, and I've forgotten, who was it? Was it George Bernard Shaw or somebody said that if you're going to tell people the truth, you have to make them laugh or they'll kill you. I think somebody will correct me and know the British author who said that. So I think that's the best thing to do, is if you can find a funny way to say it, people are much more likely to take it in. They confuse the affect sometimes with the message.
Mm.
And if you're angry, they just kind of discount it. So if you can find a way to do it in a way that is light or funny,
Yes.
probably going to work better. Not that I'm good at this myself, but that's useful.
Smile more. So one person asked, this is Jessica. She said, how can a younger employee with almost 10 years experience in their field no longer be looked at as green? Is it outward appearance, inflection when speaking? How can I get my manager to take me seriously?
So I make sure I understand. So the manager is thinking you are still green, or
Still
that?
green, which is interesting because she says Jessica says she has almost 10 years experience. So how can she change that perspective of her manager?
Well, there are so many dimensions to ourselves. And when we're thinking about interacting with a supervisor, there's so many aspects of ourselves to which they are reacting to. And it could be that you're getting that reaction from them that has nothing to do with your lack of experience or your work at all. It may have to do with, the fact that the supervisor is conscious of their power over you, and they really want to pull that thing up a little bit, feel more powerful, and they're maybe threatened, so they got to play that up or something. So it could happen for lots of reasons other than your experience per se, and it may have nothing to do with you, frankly. Now, what do you do about that? Again, I think it's a problem of, do you want to confront them and say, look, I've been doing this for 10 years, right? I mean, you could remind them of that every once in a while, just say on a particular project, well, I remember seeing this back in 2008, or, that kind of thing, just to remind them. I guess I might do that a little bit. But I guess I wouldn't take it so personally that it is about you. I think often these things are about them rather than you.
Sometimes you have to remember that.
Hard to remember, yeah.
Anna, so she says, so we're going to flip to the other end of the spectrum with older workers. How can older adults who are still working respond to the question by their coworkers, when are you retiring?
Yeah, right. Well, I think, believe me, I know this question well, and we are asking it of each other. I guess personally, I don't take that negatively. I think the people who are asking it often want to retire themselves.
Yes.
So it's not that they want you out. It's like, oh, lucky you get to stop working. And we also have this perception, of course, that when people retire, they all go do glamorous things. We're moving to Fiji and start a bed or something, So I think some of it, I guess I would be inclined to see that that's what their affect is about, rather than when do we get you out of here kind of thing, but I might humorously, if you think that's what's going, you might humorously ask them, were you trying to get me out of here sooner? You want my office?
Yeah.
And I think you might get the response from them that you want, which is, no, that's not why I'm asking it,
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for one more question. It says, have you experienced ageism challenges and how did you overcome them?
Myself, no, frankly, but I'm in a pretty hierarchical place. Universities, you got tenure, you got associate professors, you got full professors, and I'm at the end of the enchilada line here, right? And so I don't experience that. What I do notice now is that there is a younger cohort kind of running things. It's people in their 50s, and which I no longer am. And the question, I guess, is what do you think about that? Do you think about it, darn it, I should be running these things? Or do you think, well, it's their turn, right? So I guess I have not felt it. It's possible that it has happened, but again, my context is maybe different than my work context is different than a lot of folks. So it may be a much more common thing. I just don't see it myself.
So I appreciate your context all the way around. Peter, you have dropped so much knowledge on us. I hope everyone was taking notes, and thank you so much for your time and your willingness to share everything that that we talked about today.
Good, thank you. And thank everybody for coming. This is quite a crowd.